Okay, my name's Donald W. Pageler. I was born and raised in a small town in Kansas at 2,500. As I usually say, this really isn't about me, it's about my crew and my ship. Although I will give you my background so that you can kind of evaluate the authenticity of what I'm telling you. I grew up an excellent athlete, a mediocre student. As I said, I had taken second in the state in low hurdles. My football coach said he could get me a scholarship in both football and track to a small southeastern college in Kansas. I decided not to take that because I knew I wasn't prepared to work in college, and I felt the coaches would be laying guilt trip on me, and I proved myself right. So my mother cooked up a scheme for me to go to a private men's college in Fulton, Missouri, by the name of Westminster College, which is where Winston Churchill gave his speech and dubbed the name Iron Curtain. He was on an American tour and gave this speech at Westminster College. I lived up to my own expectations. After a year and a half, I flunked out. I had always kind of wanted to go in the Navy. My uncle had been a communications officer in merchant ships during World War II in the Pacific on Liberty ships, and so I went up to Manhattan, Kansas, and talked to the Navy recruiter. And the other reason I joined, besides my uncle, was I really didn't want to be a ground pounder in Vietnam. So the recruiter looked at me and said, well, you know, every 2 years the state of Kansas sends a whole company of recruits to Navy boot camp in San Diego. I'll put you on a 120-day delay program, and in June you'll go to boot camp with 80 other guys from the state of Kansas. So I was in boot camp from June of '66 to through August of '66. One of the more important stories out of boot camp was while you're in Navy boot camp, they put you through a very large battery of tests. And then you get to put down 3 choices of things that you might want to do in the Navy. And then towards the end of boot camp, you go to for interviews with the personnelman. He looked at my scores and he said, just a minute. He went away and he came back and he said, follow me. And we walked down this hallway and he opened up this door to this room, and in the room was a table with 2 chairs and a chief sitting in one of the chairs, and he said, go in here and talk to this man. So I went in there, and back in those days they called us communications technicians. In the 70s they got a little more honest about it. They called the guys crypto technicians. And so he said, how would you like to become a communications technician? I said, my brain was going 90 miles an hour. I thought, well, I'm sure it needs swabbing decks. So I said, gee, I don't know, what is it? And so he opened up this 3-ring binder, and it had 1 sleeve in it with 1 sheet of paper that had about a third of a sheet of paragraph on it. And I swore I was dumber after I read it than I was before I read it. That's how vague it was. And so I was still thinking we'll be swabbing decks. So I said, gee, I don't know, it doesn't sound too bad. Maybe I'll put it down for my 3rd choice. And he looked at me and he said, son, the only way you can become a communications technician in the Naval Security Group is if I recommend you. And the only way I'm going to recommend you is if you put it down for your 1st choice. So that's how I became a crypto technician, was with 1 arm twisted behind my back. And so then in September I went to CT school in Pensacola, Florida. I was in crypto school from September to March of '67. I went home on leave after completing school and got married, reported to the Liberty late March, and we went to sea the May the 2nd. We were attacked June the 8th, and so now I'll start in with the show and cover more of that. When I was debriefed after the attack was over, I was told, you've got the highest security clearance anybody can get in this country. Go away, never talk about this to anybody, including your family. So for 20 years I kept it all bottled up inside. In '85, I began to lose my vision. I couldn't see the center stripe in the road when I was driving down the road. I ended up in a doctor's office, and he came back in white as a sheet and said, "I don't know why you're still alive. You should have died a long time ago." He said, "One of your major organs should have popped." He said, "Your blood pressure is 240 over 145. And he said, "It's been that way for a long time to do the damage to the eyes." Well, fortunately, what was happening is I was having strokes in the retina of my eyes instead of my heart and my brain, where it would have killed me, which is why he thought I should have been dead. He put me on as heavy blood pressure medication as he could for a year and a half. He could only get it down to 140 to 180 over 100 to 140, which is still high. And he said, after a year and a half, I was in real deep depression. I found out about post-traumatic stress disorder therapy, and I called the hospital in Long Beach and told them what I was looking for, and they said, "We don't do anything with that here at the hospital, but the closest vet center to you is 5 blocks north of Disneyland." Within a month of being able to go talk about what happened to us, blood pressure numbers dropped 30 points. No change in medication. So that'll show you what stress will do to your body. So when you keep secrets, it's going to take a toll on you. And so anyway, at that point, my first marriage had fallen apart, and this wonderful woman came into my life, my second wife, Eva, who I lost 6 years ago unexpectedly to heart failure, along with 4 other people in my life that same year. So I'll start the show here. This is a picture of Eva and I at a stone that was erected for us at Ontario Beach State Park in Rochester, New York, put up by the VFW. And it says something that no other memorial to the Liberty has ever said, and this is something you need to evaluate about why haven't you heard of this from a historical standpoint. It says that we're the most decorated ship in the United States Navy. Nobody's ever heard of us, but we're the most decorated ship. Now, you wouldn't compare us to a World War II ship that had been through multiple battles, but for one single action, we're the most decorated ship. So this is a blow-up of that. You can read the awards and stuff on that stone. Down here is a quote by Admiral Martin, who was the 6th Fleet Admiral at the time we were attacked, and so I will go into all of that later in the presentation. This is a slide I added about a year ago because I realized my slideshow was geared to take you through all the details of what took place and what happened, and people didn't have any idea what the Liberty was. We were converted to World War II Victory-class cargo ship. So we were 465 feet long, longer than a destroyer. And so the Israelis say they didn't see a flag, and they didn't think they thought we were an Egyptian ship called the El Khazir. Well, the El Khazir was 1/4 of the displacement of the Liberty, so it was a much smaller ship. This number 5 is 30 feet tall, so how they could mistake us for anything. And they even admit later on that they had us identified at 6 o'clock in the morning on their control board in Haifa as an American intelligence ship. But they say, well, at 8 o'clock somebody took the marker off the board. So it was a convenient excuse, but I did this so that you could get a layout of the ship. This raised area up front here is called the forecastle. And so all we had for armament was 450 caliber machine guns. They were really only good for repelling boarders in case somebody tried to board our ship. There was a 50 caliber gun mount on the port side here, another one on the forecastle on the starboard side, and 2 in the back here after the bridge, midship gun mount on the port side and on the starboard side. When she was a cargo ship, the SS Simons in World War II, there would have been this would have been a large opening inside the ship, a cargo hold, and then there would have been another cargo hold here after the bridge in the back part of the ship. This is where I worked, where our intelligence spaces were. I worked 2 levels below the main deck. you'll hear me talk about later about the mess deck. It's right after the bridge. This is the bridge area right here where the captain controlled the ship from. Right after the bridge, a level below the main deck was where the mess deck was, and after the mess deck was where I slept. 2/3 of the crew were crypto technicians, 1/3 were deck crew. So the majority of the guys on the ship were crypto technicians. The other important thing is, as I said, this is the bridge area. This right here is what's called the flying bridge, which will come up during the presentation. This is a microwave antenna. We were, as I said, a converted Victor class ship. The Navy had taken 2 of these out of the merchant mothball fleet up here in Vallejo and converted them into intelligence ships. We were supposedly the most sophisticated listening platform in the world at the time. This right here is what's called Trescom, and it's a relay dish. This is 60s. I retired from Hughes Aircraft Company, Space and Communications Group. We built communications satellites. When Hughes put up its first satellite in the early 60s, it was the size of a footstool. So there really wasn't much traffic being carried by satellites back in those days. So we used this dish to bounce our signal off the moon back to Cheltenham, Maryland, to NSA headquarters. Basically, we worked for the National Security Agency. So, so that's kind of the layout of the ship. This kind of just gives a quick overview of things. After this, I'll start into where I left off earlier about leaving Norfolk on May 2nd. But the damage, we were under attack about as long as Pearl Harbor. When the Israeli fighters left, we had over 820 rocket and cannon holes in the top side of the ship, not to mention over 3,000 machine gun hits. Then they came out with bombers and dropped napalm on us. And while we were trying to fight the fires from napalm, they brought out 3 Navy torpedo boats and fired 5 torpedoes at us. And we took 1 40-foot torpedo hole on the starboard side. So as I said, we left Norfolk on May 2nd. Our normal run was up and down the west coast of Africa. We got to Abidjan, capital of the Ivory Free Coast, late May. We were supposed to have 4.5 days liberty. After a day there, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, things were heating up between the Arabs and the Israelis. The Joint Chiefs of Staff took direct control of our ship and ordered us to go to the Mediterranean. So our 4.5 days got cut to a day and a half. They ordered us to go to Rota, Spain. They said we'd get further orders once we got to Rota, Spain. So these were, the top 2 photos are on the way down in the Atlantic from Norfolk to Abidjan. Believe it or not, I was once a young person, and this was me when I was 21 in the Atlantic on the way down. The Atlantic tends to be pretty rough. When we got to Abidjan, this is where we spent our days raising cane as typical sailors, and this is called the Hotel Ivoire, and it stands for ivory, French for ivory. And so I say to most of the audiences, and there's a few here old enough to appreciate this, I usually say that hotel was owned by Pan Am, and most of the younger people in the audience look at me and go, what's a Pan Am? Pan Am was the premier airlines. I mean, it wasn't United and American, and that back in those days, Pan American was the premier airline back in those days. So that's one of the few points of levity in this program. So we went to Rota, Spain, and as I said, our liberty got cut short from 4.5 to a day and a half. As I said, we got orders to go to Rota first. This is when we docked at Rota. This happens to be pictures on my camera, although the bottom right picture is not, obviously I wasn't taking the picture because it's a picture of me. Behind the channel behind us is a subtender, and the Navy probably would have thrown me in jail if they'd have known I had this photo.
see the second.
at the time, it put me in the brig, because the Navy does not like their nuclear submarines photographed. And if you look right down in front of the subtender, there's a nuclear fast attack sub sitting there. Fortunately, we had some pretty smart officers on our ship, and after the attack, they said if you took pictures, take the film out of your camera, put them in the bottom of your sea bag, and don't tell anybody you have them. And that was a really smart thing, because then I ended up at home with some pictures. But because I was told to never talk about this for 20 years, nobody ever saw this picture for 20 years, and I don't think the Navy's going to come after me now. But anyway, we got orders to head to the Sinai. We were right off the Gaza Strip, and we were sailing 12 to 15 miles off the Strip at about 5 knots on the 7th and the 8th. And as I said, all we had was 450 caliber machine guns. This was before the attack, obviously. This is our executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Armstrong. He was a Naval Academy graduate. This is him. He died during the attack. And the man next to him was one of my crypto chiefs, Chief Smith. He died during the attack. There's now a school building named after him at Pensacola, where I was trained as a crypto technician. This is 3 of our top officers that were sunbathing a few hours before we were attacked. This is Armstrong here in the front. Behind him is Lieutenant Golden. Lieutenant Golden was what was called an LDO, a limited duty officer. It's a person who gets promoted into the officer's rank out of the enlisted ranks. And George was our engineering officer. George ended up having 2 ships shot at from under him during World War II. So needless to say, after the Liberty, he became an extremely religious man, wondering why he was still alive. This is Captain McGonigal, a little more local California flavor. Bill grew up and went to Coachella Valley High School, which is the east end of the Palm Springs area. His dad was a migrant farm worker. Bill was a good athlete. I was telling somebody the small world story, and I went through post-traumatic stress disorder therapy between 87 and 90. Every year our PTSD group was in the Huntington Beach 4th of July parade, which is one of the largest parades west of the Mississippi. And we were forming up, and I looked a half a block down the street, and there was a float with 2 Medal of Honor guys on it. And I went, geez Christ, that's the captain of my ship. So I walked down the street and I said, Captain McGonigal, I was on the Liberty with you. And so we got to talking. And that's when he told me he had retired in Palm Springs. So then he introduced me to the other guy on the float. The other guy on the float was Walter Ehlers. He lived in Buena Park. Walter was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from D-Day. So Walter and I got to talking, and Walter asked me where I grew up, and I said, well, Walnega, Kansas. And he said, my God, I grew up 13 miles from you in Manhattan, Kansas. So it was really a small world day. So Bill's a local guy. Terry, who I'll get into later, lived here in Visalia, although he didn't grow up here. So my job, the crypto technicians, we stood 3 8-hour watches, an eve, a mid, and a day watch. I had just come off the mid watch, which was midnight to 8 in the morning. So I went to the mess deck, if you remember the layout of the ship, and ate breakfast, went into my sleeping compartment, which was just after the mess deck, crawled in a rack bed in the Navy, and at 1 o'clock, the general quarters alarm went off. Captain McGonigal had called the general quarters alarm, drill. So I got out, got dressed. My general quarters station was on the mess deck right forward of where I was sleeping, so I went in there. I was supposed to be in charge of a submergible pump. About 1:35, 1:40, we secured from the general quarters drill And so I and some of the other guys that were off duty went up to the fantail to relax a little bit. I was just back going back down the ladder into my sleeping compartment just before 2 o'clock when the General Carter's alarm went off again and the attack started. And I heard all the metal from the fighter jets hitting topside. And so the Israelis had run 9 to 13 reconnaissance missions on us in the morning, depending on what you want to use as your documentation, but really doesn't make any difference, 9 or 13. And they, as I said earlier, they even admit they had us identified as an American intelligence ship at 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, this is one of the recon planes in the morning. So this is the start of the attack. That's one of the first fighter jets coming in at us. This is a picture of me with 2 of the 820 rocket holes. So we're not talking about small holes here. And a lot of those rockets then would explode once they had gone through the bulkhead. And so this is Captain McGonigal on the bridge looking at their rocket hole. This is Ensign Lucas with two of the rocket holes. This is taken in the same place as me. It's one of my shipmates. Herb lives in Missouri now. He was a crypto technician too. This is on the port side, 2 more of the rocket holes. Again, this is a picture of the Trescom antenna, just more battle damage. These are pictures that I took. I was on the aft part of the ship, looking on the starboard side up towards the aft part of the bridge. You can see 3 rocket holes there. Up above it was what we call the flying bridge. This right here is kind of looking over to this direction from where that picture is taking. And this is where our whaleboat hung. It burnt from all the napalm fires, so we didn't have that boat anymore. This picture ended up in Life magazine, and if you want an overall, you can see how our whole ship was just covered with holes. It's amazing that we ended up with, out of 294 guys, 34 dead and 174 wounded, which is 70% of the crew. And if you look at all the damage, it's amazing that we didn't have more casualty count than that. But the 70% is probably why we're the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy. So this is a picture of, I was up front looking aft towards the bridge. Same thing here. If you look right here, you know, it looks like it might be fire. That's actually paint chipped off the bridge from machine gun fire. It's like somebody just took a jackhammer and chipped off the paint. This is looking over here, over to the port side of the bridge. 3 more rocket holes, again, the bridge area. So, Ennis's book, which there are 5 of the books are there, and in the handout, I hope Roy gave you a copy of the handouts. In the handout is a book list. And in Ennis's book, he said that he looked forward, and Alexander Thompson, our gunner's mate, was in this forward starboard gunman. He said he saw Thompson get hit by a rocket, and he said Thompson flew in the air like a rag doll end over end. And so this is the next day when I took these photos, and this forecastle, this is what's left of Thompson, his blood running down the forecastle here. And so then after I took that picture, I went up on the forecastle here and took a picture looking into that gunman, and that's this picture. Okay, now again, I said this is the next day. The USS Davis is sailing right alongside of us in the background. This is their anti-aircraft gun. You can see this is our little 50 caliber pea shooter. So as I said, we didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of fighting off fighter jet aircraft. Oops, I I'm not sure if yeah, I did. So these are pictures of cabin area. This is Captain McGonigal in his cabin. You can see a rocket hole right underneath the porthole. This is a picture looking out of the rocket hole in Lieutenant Golden's cabin. This is our main mast. It even has a rocket hole, although you can't see it very well in it. And these are two of our antenna mounts. Now, you can see the antenna right there coming out of the top of it. The Israelis were using heat-sinking missiles, and antennas radiate a lot of heat. So they immediately took out all our communications capabilities. But we were fortunate that we had one antenna that was down for repairs and wasn't emitting any heat. So Terry Albardier, who lived here in Visalia, who I used to stop and have dinner with about 3 times a year after my wife died, was an ET, an electronics technician. He took a long line, a coax cable, and ran it from the Radio Shack out to the antenna mount that had not been being used, and that's the only reason we got a distress call out. So Terry, nobody realized what Terry had done until '99 at our '99 reunion in Virginia Beach. So we got Terry awarded the Silver Star. So in 2012, I came up to Nuna's office up here when Nunes gave Terry his Silver Star. Now, as I said to a reporter that day, if Terry hadn't done what he did, probably the rest of us wouldn't have survived and we wouldn't be here today. So Terry is a very important local guy. He grew up in Texas. One of the things that Roy and I are going to try and do is get June 8th named USS Liberty and Terry Albardier Remembrance Day. So whether we'll be successful with the politicians or not, God only knows. So this is more battle damage. This picture right here, this hatch, if you look at that, the metal's going out. So that rocket went in the starboard, came in the starboard side of the ship, passed clear through the ship, and came out this hatch on the port side. So as I said, and I said earlier, after the fighters, then they came out with bombers and dropped napalm on us. I did this slideshow after going into deep depression. I went, what happened to us? And my memory, even to this day, is like, you know, most of us think back in our past, we don't remember every second, what we did every second of the day, but you pretty much feel comfortable that you know how you spent your time. Well, for me, this is all like a jigsaw puzzle of pictures that I try to fit together. So it's very annoying for me. And so I did this slideshow about 25 years ago or more. So at that time, at the time right after the attack, they had 171 wounded. Since that time, we have had 3 guys apply for, including Terry, and got Purple Hearts that didn't get them back then. So that number has grown from 171 to 174. My own story was the following day, somebody grabbed me and said, report to sick bay, and I said, why? I'm not hurt that bad. And they looked at me and said, it's an order, report to sick bay. So I went to sick bay, Corpsman got out his logbook, logged in what he saw. Next thing I knew, 6 months later when I'm in Hawaii at my next duty station, I got a letter from the State Department saying, here's your Purple Heart, here's a check for $300 for your wounds. Sign this piece of paper that says you agree to never sue the State of Israel. And so, you know, the White House started the cover up immediately. They even sent out telegrams to the 34 families of the dead a day or two later. And in the telegrams they said that it was a mistake. The State Department had sent out telegrams to the 34 families of the dead saying that the attack was a mistake, which is almost impossible to believe in the sense that we sailed the ship for 1,000 miles across the Mediterranean for 6 days and put her in dry dock in Malta, which we will get to towards the end later on in the slideshow. But how they could be saying it was a mistake when we hadn't even started the court of inquiry yet, it says something all in of itself. And I covered on this slide why the 171 is now 174. I think I was talking about my job and what I was doing. And as I said, I was supposed to be in charge of a submergible pump. And obviously there was no need for a submergible pump. So somebody grabbed me and said, go to the bridge and bring down wounded. So I and another guy went to the bridge, and I remember that opening up the hatch, and they had a guy on a stretcher, and so we grabbed it and we hauled it back down to the mess decks, which is what I consider probably where most of my injuries came from, trying to haul. I don't know how many of you have ever been on a Navy ship. I just went on the USS Midway a couple of years ago. Ladders on Navy ships are extremely steep. I wonder, how did I ever carry a stretcher down these ladders? And then we had to go down 3 or 4 sets of ladders from the bridge to the mess deck. So I think a lot of my injuries came from bouncing off the ladders. But I had minor cuts and burns and bruises, which I can get into later. I had, as I said, I told them I wasn't hurt that bad. One of my big things that I needed to go through in post-traumatic stress disorder therapy was survivor's guilt. But I'll get into that after I get into the cleanup in Malta. So as I said, then they came out with bombers and dropped napalm on us. And these are all photos of damage from napalm fire. I took these in sequence. The bottom left here is one of our inflatable life raft racks. Obviously there's nothing on there because they all burnt. If you look at this photo, right here is that attach point where the top of the life raft rack attached to the bulkhead. And this is all burnt. You can see charred by napalm. Then I looked up above me, and that's that same attach point. So right above me was the midship port gun mount. Then I went up on the level above and took a picture looking into the gun mount. This is more of the napalm fire damage. You can see right here where the fire line stopped. There's still pain here. Here's the Trescom in the background with, I think, the starboard side gun mount. So all this was burnt by napalm. It's all at the aft end of the ship. This was probably the next day. This is Lieutenant Painter. He's one of my crypto officers, standing on the bridge with Captain McGonigal. Captain McGonigal had his pant leg cut off. It looks like his leg's missing, but it's not. It's just dark. We had to take his belt off and put a tourniquet on his leg to keep him from bleeding to death that night because he had such bad shrapnel damage. As a matter of fact, he spent the whole night laying on his back on the bridge, navigating by looking at the stars, trying to direct the ship. And in your handout is a copy of his Medal of Honor citation. One thing I didn't have a chance today, earlier at the class, to say was that when Bill was given his Medal of Honor, one of the cover-ups was the Medal of Honor is almost always given by the President at the White House. Bill received his medal in the Washington Naval Shipyard from the Secretary of the Navy. I even have a memo out of the Lyndon Johnson Library that when Bill's Medal of Honor and my Presidential Unit citation were sent to the White House for signature, Johnson's chief staff member, Jim Cross, wrote this memo that said, we recommend you approve these and return them to the Department of Defense for presentation and no press release be made by the White House. So again, that's just all a part of, you know, trying to keep it all out of the public eye. Years later, when Bill would give a talk about us, I would see him, he would grab his Medal of Honor and say, "I wear this for my whole crew." He said, because I was so inspired that my crew was not giving up their need to save their ship, that's why I stayed at my post for 17 hours after the attack. So it was, as I said on that Purple Heart interview, it was a true effort of teamwork. We were all running around scared as hell, going, as long as the old man's still on the bridge, we might still have a chance to survive this thing. And he was giving us credit, and we were giving him credit. So, and that's the only reason we survived. That and the fact that he ran us regular with general quarters drills, so when we were attacked, we knew what to do. Anyway, so again, at the beginning, I told you where the mess deck was. So this is where we had the badly wounded on the mess decks. And you can see this guy right here now lives in Hawaii. He's been in and out of VA hospitals all his life. The only, oh no, it's, well, it might be him there, but it's definitely him here. Larry lives on Maui. The only other point of levity in this slideshow, I'd say, is one of my crypto shipmates right here. If you get a look at his nose, not that I don't have a beak myself, but his nickname was Bullwinkle, for anybody that's old enough to remember the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. So anyway, so as I said, after the bombers, they brought out 3 Navy torpedo boats, fired 5 torpedoes at us. So 9 of the guys died topside during the air attack. 25 died where the torpedo hit. To continue with my experience, so during the air attack, I spent most of my time, I think, running wounded from the bridge down to the mess decks. I don't even know how many runs I made back and forth. My memory just hasn't logged that. And then when Captain McGonigal said prepare for a torpedo attack, I remember one of my shipmates being on his knees on the mess deck with his rosary beads saying goodbye to life. And then I remember one of the old salts that had been in the Navy for a long time said, "Throw yourself across the wounded," which was a good thing because I did that, and so did everybody else that was standing. And when the torpedo hit, it was like there was a giant on one side of the ship and just lifted it up, and then we slowly sank back down in the water. And if we hadn't have done that, all these guys would have just rolled off the mess tables onto the deck. So it's a good thing we had a few guys with experience on the thing. So as I said before, we sailed her 1,000 miles for 6 days across the Mediterranean, put her in dry. Oh, and so after we took the torpedo, somebody grabbed me and said, "Take the submergible pump forward." I got up to the hatch. The torpedo hit where I worked. And so I got up to the hatch leading into my working spaces, which was so secure because we all had top secret crypto clearances. Even Captain McGonigal couldn't come down to our spaces. If he wanted to come down there, he had to call down and have somebody escort him. That's, I mean, he was like a taxi driver. And so, but I got up there just in time when one of the officers, this is why the officers get paid the big money. I got up there just in time when one of the officers was making the decision to close off the hatch to make the ship watertight so we didn't sink. And the one thing that I remember running through my head was, God, I'm glad I'm not him. Have to live with that the rest of my life and wonder if there's anybody left alive down there. Which I don't think there was, but you know, nobody will ever know for sure. I could derail this and get off into something even longer. Our only surviving Marine was down there. He eventually got out, but they had shut the hatch once on him, heard him banging on it, and opened it up and got him back out. But anyway, so then I returned to the mess decks with the submergible pump. And later that night, Doc Kiefer, who was given the Navy Cross, grabbed me and said, "Lay down here," and they stuck a needle in me and ran a tube across the stanchion over to one of my shipmates that he was working on. And he opened him up and he said, "There's nothing I can do for him. Both his kidneys were blown out." So he sewed him up and went on to the next guy. But anyway, that's pretty much what I remember through that night, through the end of the attack, before we were dead in the water for a while, and then when we finally got the power plant back online and headed out to sea towards Malta. This is one of the 3 Israeli torpedo boats circling us. Another thing I didn't have a chance to cover today was that after the torpedo hit, McGonigal came on the intercom and said, "Prepare to abandon ship." So some of the guys topside threw our last inflatable life rafts in the water, and these torpedo boats came around and machine gun holes in the life rafts, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention, keeping servicemen from saving their own lives. So just another one of the pieces of the things that have been covered up. So this is how we kept one of the ways in which we kept the ship afloat. This is called K-shoring. We had these timbers on the ship like railroad ties, and we braced up the bulkheads next to where the torpedo had blown a hole to keep the bulkheads from caving in. This was our damage control officer, John Scott, who is the one that was telling guys to go around and count the machine gun holes, and nobody really knows how many they were. There were, one of my shipmates said we got to over 3,000, and Scott said, stop counting. One of the books that's on the table is called Attack on the Liberty, which was written by John's son, James, and that came out in 2007. And James, when he was doing his research, he was on a Harvard Fellowship when he did a lot of his research. He went to Tel Aviv to do some of his research, and he took John with him. And unfortunately, John died last fall of Alzheimer's. But he took John to Tel Aviv with him. And while he was there, James told me, he said, "I ran across an Israeli retired general, Air Force general, who had been one of the pilots that attacked you guys." So he called the guy up and said, "I'd like to come interview you." And the guy said, "No, no, no, I won't be interviewed." But he said, "I would like you to come out to the house for coffee." So James said, "I got in the taxi and went out there." And he said, "I went in the house and I was talking about John being back at the hotel." And the guy said, "You mean your dad's here?" And James said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, why didn't you bring him along?" And James said, "Well, I thought it might be kind of uncomfortable for you." And he said, "No, no, no, I want to meet him." So he called John up. John came out. He said, "My dad no sooner walked in the house, but what this guy fell all over him and apologized for attacking us." But anyway, that's an epilogue, and so he's actually in his book. Whoops. So as I said, then the following day, you saw some of the slides. The following day, we didn't see any Americans, which I will get into how that took place in it pretty quick here. The next day, the USS Davis and the USS Massey came alongside. The Davis was a destroyer, and if I'm not mistaken, I think the Massey was a destroyer escort. The Israelis tried to say that one of the reasons they attacked us was they came out to find the ship shelling shore the day before. Later, it's been pretty much an accepted fact that nobody was shelling the shore the day before. There were fuel drums blowing up on the beach, and that's what the explosions were. As I said in my angry letter to Congress, which is another thing I didn't have a chance to go into today, while I was going through PTSD, one of the guys in my group was a Marine from Vietnam, and he looked at me one night and he said, "I got to tell you, you guys got screwed as bad, if not worse than anybody I ever knew in Vietnam." He said, "You got every right to be as angry as you can be." But then he got right in my face and said, "But it's your anger, what are you going to do about it?" Well, it took me 4.5 years chewing on that before I ever could come up with an answer. I wasn't going to write Congress. I knew they weren't going to do anything. Political cover-up all these years, they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I finally decided with my high blood pressure and everything, I had to do something to get rid of this anger. So I write a 3-page letter with 30 pages of documentation to every California and Kansas congressman and senator. They all passed the buck back to my local congressman in Orange County, which at that time was Rohrabacher. He asked me to come in and talk to him, and he sat across his desk and looked at me and said, "I've read everything you've written, all the material you sent me." He said, "There's no way I believe this was a mistake on the part of the Israelis." But I said, "I got to tell you, Congress won't touch this till after there's peace in the Middle East." Well, that's not going to be in my lifetime. So it's what I already knew, but it got me what I needed, which was for me to quit carrying all the anger around by myself. I gave it to Congress. If they can live with it and go to sleep at night, more power to them. So anyway, so this was the pictures I took the following day as the Davis and the Massey came closer and closer to us. It started there and comes on around down here. Now, what I started to say earlier was the thinking that a ship was shelling the shore. My angry letter to Congress, as I said, even a Cub Scout can tell you can't shell the shore 13 miles away with a 50 caliber machine gun. Now this is the Davis. We're doing a highline transfer. That's what this bag is. That's how you transfer goods between ship at sea. But this is the Davis, which has a 5-inch gun on it. Now my neighbor is a retired fire control technician chief out of the Navy, served on lots of destroyers. And I asked him, I said, "How far will a 5-inch gun shoot?" And he said, "About 11 miles. So even that 5-inch gun wouldn't have been able to shell the ship. So, I mean, it's a very feeble excuse on the part of the Israelis. So this is also the next day. We're sailing right alongside the Davis. We're on the left, and this Davis is on the right. These were pictures of guys on the USS America taking pictures of us. Now, again, I'm going to get into why we didn't see anybody for over 18 hours. So, we were attacked at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At 2:05, we got a distress call out. Captain Tully was captain of the Saratoga, one of the 2 carriers. Joe had retired in Carmel. He and Ruth lived in Carmel, and my wife and I used to go up and take him out to dinner once a year. Poor Joe would sit in his living room and look at me with a confused look on his face and say, "I never could understand why my planes were recalled." Well, Joe said that when he got our distress call, he said, "I had 16 planes, 4 tankers, 12 fighter bombers in the air to come to your aid within 15 minutes of getting your distress call." He said, but before they were out of sight, they were recalled. So, in a couple of slides, I'll get into that recall and why we never saw help till the following day. Oop. So, this is, so the following day when the America, the other carrier, came alongside, they sent helicopters over to pick up our wounded. They couldn't sit down on our forecastle. There wasn't enough room, but they could get their landing gear down just enough that we could load the stretchers on. So we transported the badly wounded over to the America. These slides are the guys on the America unloading our wounded. Then, so here I will get into what took place as far as the White House abandoning us. My boss, Dave Lewis, who was a lieutenant commander at the time, who was also an academy graduate. Dave was 10 feet from the torpedo when it went off. And he said, I was 10 feet from the torpedo. He said, "I saw it slide in on the other side of a bulkhead." By the way, I'm sorry for the Navy lingo, bulkhead's a wall in the Navy. He said, "I saw it slide in on the other side of a bulkhead. The bulkhead shielded me from the blast, but all the paint on the bulkhead ignited. So it flash burned his body." So when we finally evacuated Dave the following day, when they got him over to the America, they had to lance his eyes open because they had been seared shut. And they cleaned him up a little bit, and they said Admiral Geis wants to see you in his cabin. So he went up to Geis's cabin, and Geis set him down, and he said, when Tully put up his planes to come to your aid, oh, by the way, Geis was the second-ranking admiral in the fleet, right under Fleet Admiral Martin. He was the wing commander over all air activity from both carriers. He told Dave, he said, when Tully put up a set of planes to come to your aid, I radioed Washington. He said, the next thing I knew, Secretary of Defense McNamara came on and said, recall the planes. He looked at Dave and said, I couldn't believe they were going to abandon you guys. So he said, the only thing I could think of is maybe they thought there were nuclear weapons on those planes. So he said, I told both the America and the Saratoga to bring up older planes from below that could only carry conventional armament. 90 minutes after the attack started, an hour and a half after the attack started, put up a set of planes from both carriers, radioed Washington again. McNamara came on and said, recall the planes. Looked at Dave and said, I still couldn't believe they were going to abandon you guys, so I decided to push it by asking to authenticate his message. In the Navy, that means, does your boss agree with the orders you're giving me? It's going over his head. He said, the next thing I knew, Lyndon Johnson came on and said, recall the damn planes, I don't care who dies, I'm not going to endorse my allies. So the White House left us for dead. These are pictures of the guys that were evacuated to the America. This is on the America. I obviously wasn't there because I stayed with the ship. I was what you call walking wounded and went to Malta with the ship. So they had the memorial service though for our 34 dead, and so the Marines got their exercise doing the service for us. So as I have said earlier, we sailed the ship a week. We could only do 5 knots because we were the ship shook. The drive shaft must have been kind of bent because the ship shook if we went any faster than 5 knots. So to continue with what I did during this whole thing, on the way to Malta, if you remember the slide about the K-shoring, that night they took me up there with a 1-battery flashlight that didn't put out much light, and said, watch this K-shoring, make sure it doesn't give way. And I thought, great, if it does, I'm going to be washing overboard. And so then one of the other duties during those 6 days on the way to Malta was they took me down in the very bottom of the ship where we called Shaft Alley, and where the engine room, the drive shaft room from the engine room back to the screw, which is a propeller in the Navy. And they said, watch this drive shaft, and if we start to take on water down here, use these headphones and call the bridge and tell them we got to abandon ship. And I remember thinking, God, that's great. You guys might get off of here, but I'm going to be stuck in the bottom of this thing. So those were my 2 duties that I remember doing on the way to Malta. I know there were other things that took place. I do remember at one time I was laying in the rack and somebody dropped a big piece of metal topside, and I remember I thought I was out of the bed and on the ground before the sound hit my eardrums. I mean, that's how jumpy everybody was. But anyway, back to this slide, like I said, we then sailed her to Malta. When we got there, I'll get into that in a minute. This is when we got to Malta, or on the way to Malta, I should say, and you can see how we're listing to the starboard side in both of these pictures. There's one slide in here, I don't know that I've gotten to it yet, that said we had a 15-degree list. My understanding is we went to a maximum of a 15-degree list. We actually were at a 9-degree list on the way to Malta. So this is when we got to Malta. We're still in the water. This is Valletta. This is the seawall there. And so this is the tip of the torpedo hole. We're still in the water here. Same thing with this right here. So, but this is just the tip. So since the torpedo hit where I worked, it was all classified. First they covered it with a tarp, then they sent in these 3 divers to inspect what was in there. Then, so this is after they pumped out the water, you can see, so we're in dry dock. And on the right here, this is that tip. This is the water line, okay? All the rest of this is torpedo hole. It's all would have been underwater. To give you a visual perspective of how big the torpedo hole is, see that guy right there, that white hat? That's one of my shipmates standing there. So as I said earlier on, it's a 40-foot hole. As somebody told me during one of my presentations, geez, you could put your whole house in that hole. So these were pictures taken inside. I spent 2 days bagging up the 25 guys that were blown apart by the torpedo. In the first 15 minutes, I found an arm, a little more California story. I spent, in the first 15 minutes, I found an arm, and his name was Phil Tiki. And after that, I just blocked out the rest of those 2 days. I don't remember any of the rest of it. About 2011, I found out that Phil is buried in a cemetery just south of Modesto. There's a small town, starts with an H, can't say it right now. It's just south of Modesto. So my wife and I, 6 months before she died, going up to my sister's in Los Altos, we went up and visited Phil's gravesite. So that was good for me. But so anyway, some people say this was me. I'm not sure that it was. It is what I was wearing, but so were other guys. This is inside the torpedo space. As you can see here, it's just mangled metal. The next slide you will see where there were rooms that we worked in. It's all big open area like when it was a cargo ship. All the internal walls have been blown away. So then this is some of my shipmates. This is me when we were taking a break during the 2 days of bagging those 25 guys up. One of the other parts of the cover-up that I want to make sure I talk about is, of those 25 guys, 6 are buried in what we call our mass grave in Arlington. They were all just body parts, so they're all in one grave site with one headstone. When they put up the headstone originally, they wouldn't even put the name of our ship on it. It said died in the Eastern Mediterranean, like they died in some taxi cab accident in Beirut. It took us 15 years to raise enough hell to get it changed to kill USS Liberty. So again, just another one of the ways in which they've made sure this thing has been misrepresented over the years or unknown. So these are pretty self-explanatory slides, bringing caskets on board, some of the body bags that we bag guys up in. As I said, I had a hard time with survivor's guilt, lack of memory, trying to figure out what I did, what could I have done that I didn't do. That's all why you go through PTSD. Oh, by the way, PTSD actually was not developed with military guys. It was actually developed through rape victims. And then the psychologist got to thinking, my God, if these women are having a hard time readjusting to society, what in the hell's going on with guys coming back from combat? So that's how it kind of came to the Vietnam vet era military guys. So anyway, so after the 2 days of cleaning up, a few days later I went on Liberty. Obviously, I started my drinking at that point pretty heavily. When I was on Liberty, when I only remember one night, I was in a bar drinking cognac out of 8-ounce tumblers. And I have no idea how I got back to the ship. So I was obviously blown away. But anyway, so after about a week, they weren't going to need 294 guys when the ship got patched up, to sail her back to the U.S., and it was never going to be doing our intelligence job again. Because we had 294 people on the ship, we were never going to be doing our job again. 2/3 of us were crypto technicians, although we did do deck work. You didn't get out of that if you were low. When my off-duty hours, I oftentimes ended up chipping paint and stuff. But they weren't going to need us. Once they patched up the ship, they were just going to need a skeleton crew to sail her back to the U.S. So many of us were flown home. So I was on a flight and we had some people in our personnel department, our yeomen, or our officers that were pretty smart. They put us all under one officer's set of orders, so that when we were in transit, they couldn't take the low echelon peon guys as seamen, and we could be stuck someplace for 2 weeks, and they ship the more senior guys on. Since they put us all under one set of orders, they had to move us all together. So we had some smart guys on the ship. So anyway, so we flew from my group. I was probably a handful to 10 of us. We flew from Malta to Rota. We were bused from Rota to Madrid. We took a TWA flight from Madrid to JFK. And then I think we flew from JFK to DC, and then DC to Norfolk. And as I had said in the beginning, that's when I was debriefed, and when they told me, you've got the highest security clearance anybody can get in this country. Go away, I'll never talk about this to anybody, including your family. So then I was sent home on 30 days leave. One thing that just came to mind that I haven't said in a lot of times is, so when I got home, I sent my family used a photo lab in Manhattan, Kansas, which was 13 miles from where I live. So we mailed in the film, the negatives, to this photo lab, and they didn't come back by the time I was shipped on to my next duty station in Hawaii. So my parents eventually got the pictures. When they sent them to me in Hawaii, I ended up with prints and no negatives. So I'm not sure what that was all about, but fortunately I had a friend who shot 35 millimeter camera way back in those days, and so he shot them with his camera. So I've ended up with some negatives from it secondhand. But anyway, I guess that kind of takes me through the end of the attack and how I was sent home. So let's go on. So they patched her up, and these are pictures of her on the way back to Norfolk from Malta. Now, to give you an idea, we were flying the flight. This is our normal steaming colors. It's a 5 by 8 foot flight, so that's what would have been flying at the time the attack started. Our signalman, in the middle of the attack, that flag got so shot up that our signalman ran up our holiday colors, which is a 7 by 13 foot flag. It's a huge flag. So how out of all of that they could say, well, we didn't see a flag, is kind of unbelievable. So this is when they got back, and they didn't bring her into Norfolk. I think they probably wanted to escape press coverage if they could. So they brought her into Little Creek, and Little Creek's a small naval base about 15 miles south of Norfolk. So this is her docking in Little Creek. So this is the end of my basic slideshow. So I always tell my audiences, so on Memorial Day, try to remember these 34 guys that gave their life for their country. So as I said, since that time, I've actually not only visited Phil Tiki's grave, Anthony Mindel is buried in Glendale, which is a suburb of Phoenix. So a few years ago I went over and visited his grave. So anybody that's buried here in the Southwest, I've tried to go see. One of the guys that, if you go through, especially Attack on the Liberty book, that Doc Kiefer spent hours on trying to save, he was from Wichita, Kansas, which is about 130 miles from my hometown. And by the way, he was Jewish. And his family called my family a few days after the attack to see if my family had heard anything about whether I was alive or not. So back in 2014, when I was back in Kansas, on the way through Wichita, I stopped and visited. His name was Gary Blanchard. I stopped to visit Gary's grave. So there's a whole nother story that I guess I can tell you about when they said we could write letters home after the attack, but they wouldn't have gone out until we got to Malta probably. I don't know, they might have gone out before that to one of the carriers or something. But whatever, the families didn't get any kind of notification from us for over a week. So my family living in Kansas, they first called Bob Dole's office. And Dole's office couldn't tell them anything. Well, we had a good friend in our hometown who was a judge who had been elevated. He had become a Kansas Supreme Court justice in Topeka, Kansas. So they called Bob Call, and Bob called him back a couple of days later and said, yeah, I found out that Don's still alive. So about 10, 15 years ago, one time Bob told me, he says, next time you're back in Kansas, I want you to meet the guy that I found out from you were still alive. So we went to lunch when I was back there, and he introduced me to this guy, and this guy was at the time we were attacked, this guy was captain of the Naval Reserve Base in Topeka, Kansas. So I looked at the guy and I said, what did you do when you were in the Navy? And he looked at me and he said, well, I was a dirigible pilot. You don't meet very many of those people. I don't know if you know what a dirigible is. Have you ever heard of the Hindenburg?
Yeah.
Like the Goodyear blimp?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what a dirigible is. And so, anyway, so that was kind of an offshoot of this that I've always thought was kind of interesting, that this guy had been a dirigible pilot, and he was the one that had obviously had connections throughout the Navy and found out that I was still kicking. So anyway, about 6 years ago, this fellow was back in D.C., and at the time Ernie Gallo was president of our Liberty Veterans Association, and they were having a thing at Arlington. And Ernie made the statement to the crowd, I don't know why there aren't any Jews that ever help us. And Bob was sitting in the audience, and it tweaked his guilt. And he said, all right, here I am. So then a few months later, Ernie called me up and he said, there's a Jewish retired oral surgeon that lives about 40 miles from here. Would you please call him? So I did, and so Bob and I have been putting in Freedom of Information Act requests with everybody in the world over the last 6 years, and we have found some very interesting things. And so I tacked some of those on to the end of this. This is a declassified CIA document, and if you read that second paragraph there, it says that Moshe Dayan, who would have been like McNamara, the head of the IDF, their Secretary of Defense, Moshe Dayan ordered the attack on us. His own general told him, this is an American ship, and you shouldn't do this. If you do, it's pure murder. And he ordered the attack on us anyway. And so then it goes on to say that then after the torpedo boats unloaded on us and they didn't manage to sink us, according to this CIA memo, Diane wanted to send out a second wave of Navy boats to finish us off, and the Admiral refused to issue the order to send the second wave of Navy boats out after us. So that's one of the things. Now when we first got this, you'll see here that the only thing that is not on here that has been redacted is who is telling this at the CIA. It's right here. That's the only redaction that's still there. Bob and I started with this. We found this around 2012 on the CIA website. At that time, there were a lot of redactions down below. We put in a Freedom of Information Act to get the redacted portions. They sent us back a thing that had more release than the other, but not all of it. So then we put in an appeal. And I don't remember if it was the appeal or after the appeal, and we put in for mediation. One of them, they said, take a hike, we're not giving you anything more. So that's how we ended up with this final document that is as much as it is. Dr. Bob and I think, surmise ourselves, we think it was probably John Haddon, who was Tel Aviv CIA station chief at the time we were attacked. But that's just a guess. We don't know that. So one of the, there are other documents here. One is about Turkish oil, a Turkish ambassador, and the other is about Middle East oil. And both of them make reference to the fact that it's that it was a deliberate attack. Oops. So then we also got it from NSA. We got a couple of interviews, NSA interviews, and one of them was with a guy by the name of General Carter, and General Carter was director of the NSA at the time we were attacked. And in his interview is almost 300 pages long, but I've copied just the pages about the Liberty, and he said the next day or so he was called before Congress. He was asked if he thought it was deliberate, and he said, I looked at him and said it couldn't have been anything but deliberate. And he said that was no sooner out of my mouth, but what Secretary Vance jumped up and said, well, that's premature. So again, it was the White House interceding on the part of the Israelis. So, so this is part of Carter's statement right there. You see, I magic marked it and stuff. So then, let's see, one of the other things that we talked about earlier that I want to get on tape was that there was a guy who was a senior analyst at NSA. His name was Eugene Scheck. We got his interview, and he said that he remembered seeing Hebrew tasking for the Liberty. So Bob and I put in a Freedom of Information Act with NSA to find out about whether there were Hebrew linguists on the Liberty or not. They came back and said it was only our job to task the Liberty. It was the Navy's job to supply personnel. You'd have to go to the Navy for that. So we put in a FOIA with the Navy, with Naval Intelligence. Naval Intelligence said we're only required to keep things like that for 2 years and we can destroy them. So they told us, they said, if the documents still exist, you need to, they would be with NARA, the National Archives. So then we put in a Freedom of Information Act with the National Archives. Well, we didn't hear anything for a long time. Finally, one day when I wasn't up at Bob's house, he got hot under the collar and he called our National Archives, he called NARA, and he said, you've got some more than just a basic level analyst. I don't know how high level the guy was, and he said, you're probably not going to get what you want. He said, the information you want is in the same vault as the Kennedy killing. So that was one of the other exercises that Bob and I have gotten thousands of pages declassified. Not all of it directly refers to the Liberty. I have a living room full of documents at home that I'm probably going to give to the University of Kansas. So from here, then, there are the things, and if you have questions, that's fine, but I added for coming up here, this is Terry Halbardier's Silver Star. And I covered earlier about Terry and why he was given the Silver Star, stringing the antenna the wire out to the antenna. Terry lived here in Visalia. My wife died 6 years ago, and trying to deal with my depression with losing 5 people in my life, I would go to my sister's 3 or 4 times a year, and every time I came north I would come through here and have dinner with Terry. So then unfortunately Terry died of a heart attack, I think 2014. So this is Terry in Nunez's office, and Nunez is pinning his silver star on him. I was there, I videotaped it, and you have the videotape. And this is Terry and I here at Applebee's, probably 2013. So, and this is Terry's headstone in Arlington. We just got him buried. His daughter didn't have what it took to get him buried in Arlington, so we just buried him about, well, less than a year ago. So anyway, that's basically, well, oh no, I meant to put Terry's stuff at the end, and it got sandwiched in between. This is a thing done by a guy by the name of Peter Myers. It's 9 reasons why the Liberty might have been attacked. And one of the things that Bob and I have found, to give you an idea, that's an offshoot that he says that one of the possibilities is they didn't want us finding anything out about Dimona. Dimona is the Israeli nuclear facility. They have finally admitted that they've had the bomb since the late 50s. But for years, up until recently, they've always sworn that they didn't have the bomb. They would never sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so Bob and I, about, well, I think it'll be probably 2 years in August, we do a lot of our research at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, which is about halfway between the two of us. And so when we were at NARA at the Nixon Library, we were down there, we found a letter written by a Brooklyn congressman to the Nixon White House that asking Nixon White House to reaffirm a memorandum of understanding that we would give the Israelis money to support their nuclear scientists and technicians and stuff. And of course they at that time said that, you know, that they don't have nuclear weapons. Well, about 3 months after the Nixon people agreed to give them the money is when the U.S. signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, and we, first of all, you can't say that the Israelis are in violation of the NPT because they never signed it. We don't know, our government didn't have proof that they had it. So technically, we weren't in violation of the NPT, but had we known, we would have been in violation of the NPT. So that's just an idea of many of the things that Bob and I have come across in trying to do our research.